So adoption is a just society's response to children in need, right? Adoption functions as an institution that meets the needs of children. And I want to contrast that with reproductive technologies which function as a market to meet the desires of adults. And I want to talk this through and kind of enumerate the differences by talking about what I think is one of the greatest legal threats to children's rights today, and that is the Uniform Parentage Act. So the Uniform Parentage Act, I think, has been around for a while, and the newest kind of iteration of it is a gender-neutral form of the Uniform Parentage Act, because when it was passed in Washington State last year, the sponsor of the bill said, what are you going to do? Gay marriage is legal. I mean, it's unconstitutional to even list the words mother and father in parenthood laws. And he's right. And he's right. You know, we missed the boat so bad on gay marriage because we were so focused on adults. And so he's right, right? So now we in Washington State have the Uniform Parentage Act, which did several things. It legalized commercial surrogacy, and it didn't even say that the surrogate needed to live in Washington State or be a U.S. citizen. You could have a surrogate in Mexico who touches ground in Washington one time for some kind of consultation, and then all the rest of the services happen in Mexico, right? It doesn't require that any of the intended parents be U.S. citizens. It's intent-based parenthood, right? So the intended parents don't need to have any kind of genetic connection to the child at all. It scrubbed the law of all references to gender, so there's no expectation that children should or ought to be raised by a man and a woman. It did away with any kind of expectation that there would be only two or must be two parents, so you could have 1, 2, 4. It's not really specified adults who could become parents. So if you have the means to assemble egg and sperm and womb, you can walk out of the hospital in Illinois or India, because the baby doesn't have to be born in Washington State, with a legal surrogacy contract, legal parenthood contract, backed by the forces of Washington State. So I testified against this bill, and I did so by contrasting the Uniform Parentage Act with the best practices of adoption. Because back when I was pre-baby, pre-my own babies, I worked at the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world. One of the things I was responsible for as the assistant director was to ensure that we were in compliance with the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoptions, which was instituted to prevent things like baby selling and trafficking. And there was a lot of very specific provisions in there to ensure that this desire for children did not bleed over into baby selling. There's also been best practices within the adoption world domestically that have evolved because social workers are very focused on the best interest of the child. The Uniform Parentage Act and intent-based parenthood laws defy all of that. So, number one, in adoption, the right to the child's best interest is a primary consideration. In adoption, agencies are constantly thinking, what is the best thing for this kid? When I worked at my adoption agency, our founder and director would say, we're not here to find a child for every couple. We're here to find parents for every child, right? The child is our client, not the adults. The adults might be paying the fees, the kid's our client. The fertility industry exists to provide a baby to any adult, regardless of the cost. Right? Their client is the adult. And that means, you know, in the adoption world, not every adult that wants a kid is going to get one. In the fertility world, you can have a baby if you've got the money, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not you're fit to be a parent. Number two, the right to not be separated from your birth parents against your will. There are so many processes, either internationally or domestically, to ensure that you're not just snatching a kid from their parents, right? You have to go through processes for parental relinquishment, and there's courts involved. And in the international world, you have to do some investigation to make sure that this child has not been trafficked. And those provisions are there because social workers have recognized that we are about to inflict harm by separating this child from their birth parents. We better make sure that they actually are a child in need. Adoption is a last resort, right? Especially now in the foster care system. I'd say sometimes we lean too far and say trying to keep the child with the birth parents, even if it's an unhealthy situation. But social workers have recognized whenever possible, we want to keep this child with its family of origin. In contrast, in the reproductive world, that loss of biological parents is intentional, right? And casual. People think it's no big deal. Number 3, the right to safe placements. So social workers are licensed and approved because for the purpose of ensuring that the adoptive parents are screened and vetted, references, background checks, supervision, post-placement reports. My husband and I, our youngest son is adopted, right? And we went through all of that, physical exams, financial statements. They came to our house, they checked it out, they scrutinized us. Do you know why? Because it's risky to give a kid to an unrelated adult. And it's a violation of the best practices. Can you imagine a social worker, oh, you want a kid? Here, take this one. Oh, we don't need to come to your house or look into you. No big deal. They would lose their license, right? Rightly so. The UPA, the Uniform Parentage Act, intent-based parenthood laws, I have yet to see one that has any kind of provision or scrutiny for parents who are walking out of the hospital with the child completely unrelated to them, right? So they can be unrelated to a child and leave, right? Really? I've talked that long? Fascinating. Granting adults parental rights simply based on intent is incredibly dangerous. And that is what turns children into commodities, right? Saying that I intend to parent this child, therefore I have a right to them. Well, now you're just talking about like buying a fancy purse or a car, right? Really, it's the same thing. The right to be born free and not bought and sold. In the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption, it prohibited payments directly to the birth mother or her family because they're like, that's baby selling. Intent-based parenthood laws, especially when it's coupled with commercial surrogacy, you can pay a woman for her child. A lot of times, even if it's her genetic child. You just have to make sure that you sign the contract before conception and not after conception. Before conception, it's a valid surrogacy contract and you're helping somebody become parents. After conception, you're baby selling and you go to jail. Of course, for the kid, the timing of the contract doesn't matter. And finally, the right to preserved kinship bonds. So the adoption world, if you know people who are adopted or have been adopted recently, most of the time it's open adoptions, right? The adoption world is moving towards open adoptions because they recognize kids benefit from as many connections with their family of origin as possible. The fertility industry favors anonymous donors, right? Where they're intentionally denied a relationship and they think it's not important, right? Kid doesn't care. I mean, sure, adoptees tend to care and it helps them, but it doesn't help donor-conceived kids, not a big deal, right? So, in summary, you know, what I say when people say, well, why are you for adoption and against donor conception and surrogacy? The answer is because a just society cares for orphans. It doesn't create them.